2 hours after I buried my wife of 40 years, my daughter-in-law decided it was the perfect time to hand me a brochure for a cheap state-funded nursing home. I did not argue. I did not scream. I just stared at her playing the part of the broken senile old man she desperately needed me to be. I shuffled out the back door, where my neighbor pulled me into his rusty truck and drove me to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. He looked me dead in the eye and told me to keep this between us and to never tell my son. When I opened that warehouse door, the reality of my family completely shattered. If you have ever given everything to your children only to have them turn their backs on you, listen closely, because what I did next changed everything. The dirt on Martha's coffin was literally still fresh. We had just returned from the cemetery, and the dull hum of distant relatives and neighbors filled the living room of my Chicago suburban home. It was a house I had paid off 15 years ago with sweat-calloused hands and 60-hour work weeks as a chief engineer. Martha and I had poured our souls into these walls. Every hardwood floorboard, every custom cabinet we had chosen together. Now the house smelled of stale funeral casseroles and cheap coffee. I was standing alone by the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the garden Martha used to tend, trying to remember how to breathe without her in the world. I was 70 years old, and for the first time in 4 decades, I felt entirely untethered. The swinging kitchen door pushed open. I did not turn around immediately. I expected it to be a neighbor offering condolences, or maybe someone asking where the extra paper plates were. But the heavy, measured footsteps belonged to my daughter-in-law, Rachel. Rachel was 35, dressed in a sharp, immaculate black designer suit that looked more appropriate for a corporate boardroom takeover than a funeral gathering. She did not have a single tear stain on her face. Her makeup was flawless, her posture rigid and calculating. She walked up beside me and placed a glossy trifold pamphlet on the granite countertop. It landed with a soft, deliberate slap. I looked down. The bold letters across the top read Shady Pines Senior Care Facility. I stared at the pamphlet, then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. Shady Pines was not a place where people went to live out their golden years in comfort. It was a notoriously underfunded state-run facility, the kind of place you only read about in local news, exposes regarding severe neglect and despair. Rachel offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. It was a terrifyingly clinical expression. She crossed her arms and tilted her head. "It is time, Dad," she said, her voice completely devoid of empathy. "We need to be realistic about the situation. You cannot possibly take care of yourself anymore. This house is far too big for one person. Derek and I have talked it over. We will be taking over the estate to manage your care properly. It is the most responsible choice for everyone." My chest tightened. Taking over the estate. She did not say she wanted to help me clean. She did not say she wanted me to move in with them. She used the words taking over the estate as if I were already dead and buried right next to Martha. I looked past her shoulder. The kitchen door swung open again, and my son Derek walked in. He was 38 years old, a sales director, who wore expensive watches, but somehow always seemed to shrink whenever his wife was in the room. He stood a few feet behind Rachel, refusing to make eye contact with me. He kept his gaze firmly fixed on the floor tiles. "Derek," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother has only been in the ground for 2 hours." Derek swallowed hard, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His hands were stuffed deep into his pockets. He finally looked up, but his eyes darted away the second they met mine. "It is just temporary, Dad," he mumbled, sounding like a child reciting a script he had been forced to memorize. "The doctor said the grief is causing early-stage dementia. You are not thinking clearly. We have to do this before you hurt yourself." The silence that followed was suffocating. I had not seen a doctor in over a year. My physical health was perfect, and my mind was as sharp as it had been when I was designing complex structural grids in my 30s. Derek was lying. My own son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had paid to put through college without taking out a single loan, was standing in my kitchen lying to my face to justify throwing me into a state facility. He had entirely surrendered his spine to his wife. A violent burning rage ignited in the pit of my stomach. Every instinct I had as a man, as a father, screamed at me to grab the pamphlet, tear it to shreds, and throw them both out of my house. I wanted to roar. I wanted to demand how they dared to speak to me this way in the home I built. But 28 years in engineering had taught me one fundamental rule about structural failure. If you react blindly to a collapse, you will get buried in the rubble. You have to step back, assess the weak points, and let the flawed structure fall before you clear the wreckage. I realized in a fraction of a second that if I fought back right now, they would use my anger as proof of my instability. Rachel would undoubtedly call Adult Protective Services, claim I was having a violent senile episode, and use the system against me. I needed time. I needed to understand what was really happening. So I did the only thing I could do. I let the engineer die, and I let the broken old man take over. I let my shoulders slump. I relaxed my jaw, making my face look hollow and confused. I raised my hand and intentionally made it tremble as I reached out and grazed the edge of the Shady Pines brochure. I let out a ragged, pathetic sigh. Maybe I whispered, staring blankly at the wall. Maybe you are right. Everything is just so confusing right now. I just need some air. I just need to breathe. Rachel exchanged a triumphant, victorious glance with Derek. She had expected a fight, and I had just given her a surrender. She actually reached out and patted my shoulder with mocking sympathy. "Take your time, Dad," she said smoothly. "We will handle everything in here." I turned away from them, keeping my gait slow and unsteady. I shuffled across the kitchen, pushed open the back door, and stepped out into the cold, biting Chicago wind. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, my posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I walked down the porch steps, my mind racing. I needed to call my lawyer. I needed to secure my bank accounts. I needed a plan to protect my home. Before I could even reach into my pocket for my phone, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I spun around, startled. It was Bill Jenkins. He had been my next-door neighbor for 20 years. A retired insurance fraud investigator, a man of few words, and one of Martha's closest friends. He was wearing a dark winter coat, and his face was grim and unreadable. He did not offer condolences. He did not ask how I was doing. He grabbed me by the arm and yanked me toward his driveway, where his rusted Ford pickup truck was already idling, exhaust pluming in the cold air. "Get in the truck, Harrison," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. "Bill, what are you doing?" I asked, resisting his pull. "I cannot leave right now. My son and his wife are inside trying to take my house." Bill opened the passenger door and shoved me inside. "I know exactly what they are doing," Bill said, slamming the door behind me and marching around to the driver's seat. He climbed in, threw the truck into gear, and sped out of the neighborhood before anyone could see us leave. I stared at him, completely bewildered. "Where are we going?" Bill gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He glared at the rearview mirror, making sure we were not being followed. "Martha told me to grab you the second those parasites made their move," he said, his voice cold as steel. "Your wife knew this day was coming, Harrison. She has been planning for it for 3 years. The engine of Bill's truck roared as he tore out of the neighborhood, taking the turns far too fast for a man his age. I gripped the door handle, my heart pounding against my ribs, but I did not ask him to slow down. The shock of his words hung heavy in the stale, heater-warmed air of the cab. Martha had been planning for this. My brilliant, pragmatic wife, who had spent her last months hooked to a morphine drip in our living room, had somehow seen this betrayal coming before I even registered the threat. As the familiar manicured lawns and pristine driveways of our subdivision blurred past the frosted windows, my mind snapped back to a conversation from earlier in the week. It was Tuesday, the morning after Martha passed away. Rachel had invited my sister and a few other extended relatives over for coffee. I was sitting in the corner armchair, staring at a blank television screen, playing the part of the shattered, grieving widower a little too well. Rachel had stood in the center of the kitchen, pouring fresh coffee and oozing a sickeningly sweet sort of sorrow. She had looked directly at my sister, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her heart. "We just want to sell the house so we can afford around-the-clock care for Dad," she had said, her voice trembling with expertly rehearsed emotion. "We have been looking at assisted living facilities. We only want the absolute best for him. Obviously, Derek and I will not keep a single dime of the sale. Every penny will go into a private trust specifically for his medical needs. We just want him to be safe and comfortable in his final years." It sounded so profoundly reasonable to the outside relatives. My sister had even walked over and hugged her, thanking Rachel for stepping up and taking charge during such a tragic time. Derek had stood by the kitchen sink, nodding solemnly, playing the dutiful son, sacrificing his childhood home for his father's well-being. The plausible lie was woven with absolute mastery. They painted themselves as martyrs, taking on the heavy, heartbreaking burden of liquidating my estate to fund my inevitable decline. They sold the narrative of a loving family, making a tough choice, masking the terrifying reality of their greed. I turned to Bill as he forcefully merged onto the interstate, heading toward the industrial district. Rachel told my sister she needed the money from the house strictly for my medical care. I said, my voice steadying as the initial shock began to wear off. She swore to the family that they were not keeping a dime. Bill let out a harsh, barking laugh that carried over the loud rumble of the aging engine. "And you bought that garbage?" "No," I replied, staring out at the sprawling gray skyline. "My gut has been screaming since Martha got sick. I just did not want to look too closely at my own son." "But the math does not add up, Bill. It never did make any sense to me. I am a retired structural engineer, and I have always been careful. My entire life has been governed by numbers, load-bearing walls, and precise calculations. You cannot hide structural flaws from someone who builds bridges for a living." I had looked up Shady Pines out of morbid curiosity when I first saw the brochure sitting on Rachel's desk a month ago. It was a notoriously underfunded state facility. The monthly cost for a resident there was barely $4,000. My house, the one Martha and I meticulously restored with our own hands and paid off entirely 15 years ago, was recently appraised at $1.2 million. Even if I lived for another 20 years in that dreadful, sterile place, the cost of my care would barely scratch the surface of the estate's total value. There would be nearly $1 million left over. $1 million in pure liquid cash that Rachel and Derek would completely control as my legally appointed guardians. The financial discrepancy was massive. It was a gaping, glaring hole in her perfectly constructed narrative. She was not trying to fund my medical care or ensure my comfort. She was trying to liquefy a massive physical asset and bury me in a cheap, forgotten facility where I would quietly fade away. I would be out of sight and completely out of mind, leaving them with a massive windfall of cash to fund whatever secret lifestyle they were hiding. The realization was a cold stone dropping into my stomach. Bill kept his eyes intensely focused on the road, his grip tight on the worn steering wheel. As a retired insurance fraud investigator, he had spent his entire career dismantling lies and tracking down hidden motives. Now he was turning that clinical, probing mind toward my family, forcing me to see the truth I had been avoiding. "Let me ask you something," Harrison Bill said, his tone shifting into a sharp, professional interrogation. "Think about the last 2 months. When Martha started declining rapidly, who handled the mail? Who went to the mailbox every afternoon?" I frowned, trying to piece the recent timeline together in my head. "Rachel did. She said I needed to focus entirely on sitting with Martha. She took over checking the mailbox and organizing the incoming bills. And your phone calls," Bill pressed, taking a sharp exit off the highway onto a cracked, desolate local road. "Who answered the landline? Who held on to your personal cell phone while you were in the bedroom?" A cold wave of realization washed over me. Derek. He told everyone I was too overwhelmed to speak. He said I was letting the grief consume me, so he screened all my calls under the guise of letting me mourn in peace. Bill nodded grimly, keeping his eyes straight ahead. Classic isolation tactics. It is step 1 in any financial exploitation playbook. You cut the target off from the outside world. You control the flow of information. You make them utterly dependent, and you make everyone else in their social circle believe the target is completely incapable of handling their own affairs. It hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The sudden lack of incoming mail. The old friends who seemingly stopped calling, or rather the friends who were told at the door that I was too fragile to come to the phone. The hushed, secretive conversations between Derek and Rachel in the hallway that abruptly stopped the second I walked into the room. It was not compassion. It was a calculated, deliberate quarantine. They were not protecting me from the stress of the world. They were actively building a cage around me, ensuring that when they finally made their move to seize the house, there would be absolutely no one left for me to turn to for help. Martha saw it happening, Bill said quietly, breaking through my dark thoughts. She saw them isolating you. But she knew if she confronted them directly, they would just deny it, twist the narrative, and accelerate their plans to push you out. She knew she was running out of time, Harrison. So she came to me for help. We drove deeper into the neglected, decaying outskirts of the city. The landscape rapidly shifted from busy suburban commercial streets to a desolate wasteland of rusted chain-link fences, overgrown dying weeds, and crumbling brick structures. We passed old, hollowed-out manufacturing plants with shattered, dirt-caked windows and empty, silent loading docks. It was a place the city had forgotten entirely, a ghost town of industry, where no one would ever think to look for two elderly men. Bill slowed the heavy truck and turned down a narrow gravel-paved alleyway, hidden carefully between two massive, dilapidated factory buildings. The tires crunched loudly against the loose stones as he navigated the tight space. He pulled up to a windowless corrugated metal warehouse that looked as though it had not been opened in decades. The gray paint was peeling off in large strips, and the metal siding was streaked with thick layers of dark orange rust. It looked entirely abandoned, a perfect hiding place tucked away from the prying eyes of the world. He cut the engine. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening, heavy with the weight of impending revelations. The quiet was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the cooling motor and the sound of the harsh winter wind howling outside. The wind rattled a loose piece of sheet metal against the side of the building, creating a hollow, echoing clang. Bill turned his body to face me. He reached deep into the pocket of his heavy wool winter coat and pulled out a long, heavy iron key. It looked ancient, completely out of place in modern times. He held it out to me, his expression deadly serious. The metal was freezing cold against my palm as I slowly took it from his hand. I looked from the heavy iron key in my hand to the bleak, forgotten building standing silently in front of us. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that the woman I had loved for 40 years had lived a second life right under my nose. "Your wife was not just dying in that bed," Harrison Bill said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that sent a shiver straight down my spine. She was preparing for an absolute war against our family. The engine of Bill's truck roared as he tore out of the neighborhood, taking the turns far too fast for a man his age. I gripped the door handle, my heart pounding against my ribs, but I did not ask him to slow down. The shock of his words hung heavy in the stale, heater-warmed air of the cab. Martha had been planning for this. My brilliant, pragmatic wife, who had spent her last months hooked to a morphine drip in our living room, had somehow seen this betrayal coming before I even registered the threat. As the familiar manicured lawns and pristine driveways of our subdivision blurred past the frosted windows, my mind snapped back to a conversation from earlier in the week. It was Tuesday, the morning after Martha passed away. Rachel had invited my sister and a few other extended relatives over for coffee. I was sitting in the corner armchair, staring at a blank television screen, playing the part of the shattered, grieving widower a little too well. Rachel had stood in the center of the kitchen, pouring fresh coffee and oozing a sickeningly sweet sort of sorrow. She had looked directly at my sister, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her heart. "We just want to sell the house so we can afford around-the-clock care for Dad," she had said, her voice trembling with expertly rehearsed emotion. "We have been looking at assisted living facilities. We only want the absolute best for him. Obviously, Derek and I will not keep a single dime of the sale. Every penny will go into a private trust specifically for his medical needs. We just want him to be safe and comfortable in his final years. It sounded so profoundly reasonable to the outside relatives. My sister had even walked over and hugged her, thanking Rachel for stepping up and taking charge during such a tragic time. Derek had stood by the kitchen sink, nodding solemnly, playing the dutiful son, sacrificing his childhood home for his father's well-being. The plausible lie was woven with absolute mastery. They painted themselves as martyrs, taking on the heavy, heartbreaking burden of liquidating my estate to fund my inevitable decline. They sold the narrative of a loving family, making a tough choice masking the terrifying reality of their greed. I turned to Bill as he forcefully merged onto the interstate, heading toward the industrial district. Rachel told my sister she needed the money from the house strictly for my medical care, I said, my voice steadying as the initial shock began to wear off. She swore to the family that they were not keeping a dime. Bill let out a harsh, barking laugh that carried over the loud rumble of the aging engine. "And you bought that garbage?" "No," I replied, staring out at the sprawling gray skyline. My gut has been screaming since Martha got sick. I just did not want to look too closely at my own son. But the math does not add up, Bill. It never did make any sense to me. I am a retired structural engineer, and I have always been careful. My entire life has been governed by numbers, load-bearing walls, and precise calculations. You cannot hide structural flaws from someone who builds bridges for a living. I had looked up Shady Pines out of morbid curiosity when I first saw the brochure sitting on Rachel's desk a month ago. It was a notoriously underfunded state facility. The monthly cost for a resident there was barely $4,000. My house, the one Martha and I meticulously restored with our own hands and paid off entirely 15 years ago, was recently appraised at $1.2 million. Even if I lived for another 20 years in that dreadful, sterile place, the cost of my care would barely scratch the surface of the estate's total value. There would be nearly $1 million left over. $1 million in pure liquid cash that Rachel and Derek would completely control as my legally appointed guardians. The financial discrepancy was massive. It was a gaping, glaring hole in her perfectly constructed narrative. She was not trying to fund my medical care or ensure my comfort. She was trying to liquefy a massive physical asset and bury me in a cheap, forgotten facility where I would quietly fade away. I would be out of sight and completely out of mind, leaving them with a massive windfall of cash to fund whatever secret lifestyle they were hiding. The realization was a cold stone dropping into my stomach. Bill kept his eyes intensely focused on the road, his grip tight on the worn steering wheel. As a retired insurance fraud investigator, he had spent his entire career dismantling lies and tracking down hidden motives. Now he was turning that clinical, probing mind toward my family, forcing me to see the truth I had been avoiding. "Let me ask you something," Harrison Bill said, his tone shifting into a sharp, professional interrogation. "Think about the last 2 months. When Martha started declining rapidly, who handled the mail? Who went to the mailbox every afternoon?" I frowned, trying to piece the recent timeline together in my head. Rachel did. She said I needed to focus entirely on sitting with Martha. She took over checking the mailbox and organizing the incoming bills. "And your phone calls," Bill pressed, taking a sharp exit off the highway onto a cracked, desolate local road. "Who answered the landline? Who held on to your personal cell phone while you were in the bedroom?" A cold wave of realization washed over me. Derek. He told everyone I was too overwhelmed to speak. He said I was letting the grief consume me, so he screened all my calls under the guise of letting me mourn in peace. Bill nodded grimly, keeping his eyes straight ahead. "Classic isolation tactics. It is step 1 in any financial exploitation playbook. You cut the target off from the outside world. You control the flow of information. You make them utterly dependent, and you make everyone else in their social circle believe the target is completely incapable of handling their own affairs." It hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The sudden lack of incoming mail. The old friends who seemingly stopped calling, or rather the friends who were told at the door that I was too fragile to come to the phone. The hushed, secretive conversations between Derek and Rachel in the hallway that abruptly stopped the second I walked into the room. It was not compassion. It was a calculated, deliberate quarantine. They were not protecting me from the stress of the world. They were actively building a cage around me, ensuring that when they finally made their move to seize the house, there would be absolutely no one left for me to turn to for help. Martha saw it happening, Bill said quietly, breaking through my dark thoughts. She saw them isolating you, but she knew if she confronted them directly, they would just deny it, twist the narrative, and accelerate their plans to push you out. She knew she was running out of time, Harrison. So she came to me for help. We drove deeper into the neglected, decaying outskirts of the city. The landscape rapidly shifted from busy suburban commercial streets to a desolate wasteland of rusted chain-link fences, overgrown dying weeds, and crumbling brick structures. We passed old, hollowed-out manufacturing plants with shattered, dirt-caked windows and empty, silent loading docks. It was a place the city had forgotten entirely, a ghost town of industry, where no one would ever think to look for two elderly men. Bill slowed the heavy truck and turned down a narrow, gravel-paved alleyway hidden carefully between two massive, dilapidated factory buildings. The tires crunched loudly against the loose stones as he navigated the tight space. He pulled up to a windowless, corrugated metal warehouse that looked as though it had not been opened in decades. The gray paint was peeling off in large strips, and the metal siding was streaked with thick layers of dark orange rust. It looked entirely abandoned, a perfect hiding place tucked away from the prying eyes of the world. He cut the engine. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening, heavy with the weight of impending revelations. The quiet was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the cooling motor and the sound of the harsh winter wind howling outside. The wind rattled a loose piece of sheet metal against the side of the building, creating a hollow, echoing clang. Bill turned his body to face me. He reached deep into the pocket of his heavy wool winter coat and pulled out a long, heavy iron key. It looked ancient, completely out of place in modern times. He held it out to me, his expression deadly serious. The metal was freezing cold against my palm as I slowly took it from his hand. I looked from the heavy iron key in my hand to the bleak, forgotten building standing silently in front of us. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized that the woman I had loved for 40 years had lived a second life right under my nose. Your wife was not just dying in that bed. Harrison, Bill said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that sent a shiver straight down my spine. She was preparing for an absolute war against our family. I stepped out of the freezing cab, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and followed Bill to the heavy corrugated metal door. He inserted the iron key, turned it with a loud metallic clack, and grabbed the rusted handle. He heaved it upward. The metal groaned in protest, sliding along its tracks to reveal the dark interior. I braced myself for the smell of mildew and rotting cardboard, fully expecting to see a lifetime of discarded junk. Instead, Bill flicked a heavy switch on the wall, and 3 rows of bright, humming fluorescent lights flooded the massive room. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. It was not a storage unit. It was a makeshift war room. The concrete floor had been swept completely clean. In the very center of the expansive space sat a heavy steel desk, and behind it, an enormous fireproof safe. But what truly paralyzed me were the walls. 3 massive whiteboards were erected along the perimeter, completely covered in printed bank statements, highlighted credit card bills, and enlarged photographs. I walked slowly toward the nearest board, feeling as though I had stepped into a surreal alternate reality. The photographs were all of Rachel. They were pictures of her entering high-end casinos, screenshots of wire transfers, and printed copies of public court records. Red strings connected dates, dollar amounts, and locations in a meticulous, undeniably professional web of investigation. I turned to Bill, my voice barely a whisper. "What is all of this? Who did this?" "Martha did," Bill replied, walking over to the desk and resting his hand on the heavy safe. "With my help, of course. She came to me 3 years ago, Harrison, right around the time Derek and Rachel got married. She noticed small things at first. The way Rachel asked about your life insurance policies. the way she casually inquired about the exact square footage and market value of your home. Martha was incredibly sharp. She knew a predator when she saw one. I stared at the boards, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of what I was looking at. Martha had been battling cancer for the last 2 years. I had watched her grow frail sitting in her armchair, with a blanket draped over her thin shoulders. I had assumed she was spending her final months resting, making peace with her life. Instead, she had been quietly working with a retired fraud investigator to map out our daughter-in-law's darkest secrets. She did not want to burden you. Bill continued, reading the confusion and hurt on my face. She knew how much you loved Derek. She knew how proud you were of the life you built for him. If she had come to you with mere suspicions, it would have torn the family apart prematurely. She needed concrete proof. She needed to build a fortress to protect you for when she was no longer around to do it herself. And to do that, she had to lock down the real assets. Bill gestured to the massive steel safe sitting behind the desk. Open it. I do not know the combination, I said, staring at the heavy dial. Yes, you do, Bill replied softly. It is the most important day of your life. I walked behind the desk, my hands trembling slightly. I knelt in front of the cold steel door and placed my fingers on the dial. I turned it to the month, the day, and the year Martha and I were married. The heavy internal locking mechanism clicked firmly into place. I pulled down on the brass lever, and the heavy door swung open smoothly. Inside the safe, there were no stacks of cash or gold bars. There were simply several thick black leather binders and a single sealed envelope resting on top of them. I reached in and pulled out the first binder. The cover was embossed with a gold seal from a prestigious downtown law firm. I opened it and began to read the legal documents inside. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, jumping from financial terminology to official bank seals. It was a portfolio for a blind trust. I looked at the bottom line of the asset declaration page, and my vision physically blurred. The total valuation of the trust was just over $12 million. I dropped the binder onto the desk, taking a staggering step back. This is impossible, I stammered, looking at Bill. We lived on my engineering pension. We paid off our house and we lived modestly. We do not have $12 million. You do now, Bill said, picking up the binder and flipping to the origin records. Do you remember that small technology startup you and Martha invested a few $1,000s into back in the late 90s? The one you both assumed went bankrupt when the dot-com bubble burst? I nodded slowly. We had written that money off as a loss decades ago. It did not go bankrupt, Bill explained. It was quietly acquired by a larger firm, which was then absorbed by a massive tech conglomerate. Martha received a letter regarding the stock conversion roughly 10 years ago. She consulted a financial advisor and let it sit and grow. She never told Derek about it because she wanted him to build his own work ethic. She did not want to ruin his drive by letting him know he stood to inherit a massive fortune. She wanted him to be a man, not a trust fund child. I stood there, in the glaring fluorescent light, letting the reality wash over me. I was not a helpless, destitute widower destined for a miserable state-funded nursing home. I was a millionaire 12 times over, and the woman I had spent my entire life with had orchestrated this absolute miracle in total silence to protect me from the greed of our own son. I reached back into the safe and took out the sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in Martha's elegant, familiar cursive. I broke the seal and pulled out 2 pieces of lined stationery. Harrison. The letter began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone and Rachel has made her move to throw you out. I am so deeply sorry to leave you to fight this battle alone, but I promise you I have given you every weapon you need. Do not weep for me, my love. We had a beautiful, wonderful life together. Instead, take this money and crush them. Derek has chosen his path, and he has chosen a parasite over his own family. Do not let them take the home we built. As I read her words, the crushing, suffocating grief that had been sitting on my chest since her funeral completely evaporated. It did not fade. It vanished, replaced by an ice-cold, diamond-hard determination. My wife had fought for me until her final breath. I was not going to dishonor her memory by letting a greedy, manipulative woman and a cowardly son discard me like garbage. I folded the first page and placed it carefully into my coat pocket. I was no longer a grieving old man. I was a hunter who had just been handed the ultimate weapon. I flipped to the second page of Martha's letter. Her handwriting became sharper, more urgent. The text outlined a specific, meticulously crafted legal trap she had set up regarding the deed to our house with the help of a high-powered trust attorney. As I read the details of the snare she had laid, I realized that avoiding their scheme was not the goal. The goal was to let them think they were winning. The trap required me to go back to the house, play the victim, and willingly walk right into the slaughterhouse they had prepared for me. Bill dropped me off at the corner of my street, exactly 1 block away from my house. The bitter winter wind whipped aggressively at my dark coat, but I hardly felt the biting cold. The fiery reality of Martha's incredible revelation was burning steadily in my chest, a furnace of absolute clarity pushing me forward. Before I had stepped out of the truck cab, Bill had reached into his glove compartment and handed me a small, unassuming black nylon pouch. Inside were 2 high-definition microcameras, the exact kind his old insurance fraud unit used for covert surveillance. I slipped the pouch deep into my coat pocket, feeling the weight of the technology against my side, and gave him a single silent nod of gratitude. I walked the remaining distance to my house using the quiet neighborhood sidewalk to physically and mentally transform myself. I deliberately hunched my shoulders, allowing the weight of gravity to artificially pull my frame downward into a defeated slouch. I reached up and messed up my neatly combed gray hair, letting strands fall unevenly across my forehead. I let my jaw hang slightly slack, practicing the vacant, terribly confused stare of an old man whose mind was slowly slipping away into the darkness of grief. When I finally reached my own front door, I intentionally fumbled with my keys for a long, agonizing moment. I made sure the metal scraped loudly and clumsily against the lock mechanism before I finally pushed the heavy oak door open. The house was extremely quiet, still smelling faintly of the catered funeral casseroles and stale coffee. Rachel and Derek were sitting together in the formal living room, whispering intensely over a large stack of legal paperwork spread across the coffee table. The moment the front door clicked shut, they both snapped their heads toward me like startled prey. Rachel let out an exaggerated, highly theatrical sigh and rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get permanently stuck in her skull. "Where on earth did you go?" she demanded, standing up abruptly and crossing her arms over her chest. "We have been looking everywhere for you. You cannot just wander off into the neighborhood like a lost toddler." I blinked slowly, letting my eyes dart around the room erratically, as if I did not quite recognize my own furniture. "I just went for a short walk," I mumbled, ensuring my voice trembled perfectly with a touch of vulnerability. "I thought Martha was out in the garden. I just wanted to see if she needed any help trimming the rose bushes." Derek winced visibly, immediately looking down at his expensive leather shoes. Rachel shot him a triumphant, validating glare that clearly communicated her satisfaction. "See, Derek," she said, her tone dripping with a sickeningly fake layer of pity. "This is exactly what the doctor warned us about. The grief is accelerating his cognitive decline rapidly. He is hallucinating. He is absolutely not safe living here by himself anymore." I simply nodded in silent agreement, keeping my gaze fixed on the floorboards, and shuffled slowly past them toward the main staircase. "I will just go up to my room," I whispered pathetically. "I am very tired today." I climbed the wooden stairs, gripping the handrail tightly, listening to their hushed, satisfied murmurs resuming behind me. They truly thought they had won. They truly thought the old man was broken and defeated. They had absolutely no idea that a predator had just walked back into their lives. I waited inside my bedroom for hours, sitting perfectly still in the dark, without turning on a single lamp. I listened to the familiar sounds of the house settling against the wind. I waited patiently until I finally heard the heavy click of the guest room door shutting down the hall, followed by the muffled sounds of Derek and Rachel getting into bed. I waited another 2 full hours after that just to be absolutely certain they were asleep. At 2 in the morning, the house was plunged into a dead, heavy silence. I slipped out of my room, moving with the silent, deliberate precision of a ghost. I crept down the wooden stairs, carefully avoiding the third and fifth steps, which I knew from decades of living here always creaked loudly. I moved directly into the living room, pulling the small black pouch from my pocket. Martha had always insisted on keeping large air purifiers in the main rooms of the house to help with her seasonal allergies. They were tall, cylindrical, and constantly hummed with a low, comforting white noise. I approached the unit in the corner of the living room, carefully popped the plastic front grille off, and nested the first micro camera deep inside the dark filter casing. The tiny lens was entirely invisible, peeking out through a ventilation slit that offered a perfect, unobstructed panoramic view of the entire room, including the dining table where they had been reviewing their papers. I secured the tiny power cable to the internal wiring, clicked the grill back into place, and moved silently to my home office down the hall. I repeated the exact same meticulous process with the second air purifier, securing the camera to face my heavy oak desk and the metal filing cabinets. Once both devices were physically installed, I pulled out my smartphone and opened the secure cloud application Bill had set up for me. I typed in the encrypted password and held my breath. 2 crystal-clear video feeds popped onto my screen, immediately complete with flawless high-definition audio. I could clearly hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway through the living room feed. The digital trap was officially armed. I snuck back upstairs and finally laid down in my bed, sleeping a deep, utterly dreamless sleep for the first time since my wife passed away. The very next morning, I initiated the next phase of the psychological game. I shuffled downstairs around 9 o'clock, wearing an old frayed gray cardigan. I sat down heavily in my worn leather recliner in the living room, pulled a thick wool blanket all the way up to my chin, and closed my eyes carefully, regulating my breathing to perfectly mimic a deep, heavy slumber. I did not have to wait long for the escalation to begin. I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of Rachel's designer heels pacing impatiently across the hardwood floor. A few minutes later, the front doorbell rang sharply. Rachel rushed to answer it, pulling the heavy door open before the chime even finished echoing through the hall. Come in quickly," she whispered urgently to a man with a gravelly, thoroughly unprofessional voice. I kept my eyes completely shut, listening intently to their footsteps. The man was a real estate appraiser, but he certainly did not sound like any legitimate professional I had ever dealt with in my career. "We need this done incredibly fast," Rachel told him, leading him right past my chair without a second thought. "We are looking for an immediate cash buyer. No contingencies, no formal structural inspections. Just give me the lowest viable market number that will guarantee a finalized sale by the end of the month." I listened carefully to the man walking around, snapping quick photos with his phone, casually evaluating the custom mahogany cabinets I had built with my own hands, the imported tile floors I had painstakingly laid down for Martha. Rachel was rushing him through the house at an absolutely breakneck speed. My gut twisted with a sharp, undeniable sense of unease. Why was she moving with such frantic urgency? If her genuine goal was simply to afford the $4,000 monthly fee for Shady Pines, there was absolutely no logical reason to seek a desperate lowball cash offer. You do not liquidate a pristine million-dollar property in a chaotic fire sale without standard inspections unless you are running from something utterly terrifying. The appraiser finished his quick tour and walked back toward the front door. "I will have the preliminary numbers sent over to you by tomorrow morning." "Mrs. Caldwell," he said bluntly, "just remember, a fast cash close means you are going to take a massive hit on the total home equity." "I do not care about the equity," Rachel snapped back instantly. "I just need the liquid cash sitting in the account before the 30th. The front door clicked shut. Rachel let out a loud, stressed exhale and marched into the kitchen to pour herself a cup of coffee. This was my moment. I threw the blanket off my lap and stood up intentionally, making my movements stiff and incredibly clumsy. I began to shuffle slowly toward the hallway, heading for the kitchen to confront the morning. As I passed the decorative wooden console table near the entryway, I purposely let my hip catch the protruding edge of the wood. Derek had carelessly left his smartphone resting dangerously close to the edge of the table overnight. My hip bumped the wood hard, and the phone went clattering onto the hardwood floor, landing face up with a loud smack. I stopped immediately, letting out a confused elderly groan, and slowly bent down to retrieve the device. As my fingers brushed against the smooth glass screen, the phone suddenly vibrated in my hand. The screen illuminated brightly, displaying a push notification banner directly across the center. It was a text message preview from an unsaved number. I froze completely, my eyes locking onto the glowing words. The text read, "Federal audit is in 28 days. Where is the 2.5 million Rachel?" I stared at the glowing screen of Derek's phone resting on the hallway console table. The words burned themselves into my retinas with terrifying clarity. Federal audit is in 28 days. Where is the 2.5 million Rachel? The puzzle pieces suddenly and violently snapped into place in my mind. Rachel was not just a greedy daughter-in-law looking to secure a premature inheritance. She was trapped. She was completely drowning in a massive financial crime, and she was intending to use my home as her personal life raft. I carefully placed the phone back on the wooden table, exactly as I had found it. I ensured my son would never know I had seen his wife's terrifying secret. My hands were perfectly steady now. I grabbed my heavy wool coat from the hall closet and stepped out into the freezing Chicago morning. Before I left, I told Derek and Rachel I was going to visit Martha's grave. I told them I needed some quiet time to speak with her and lay some fresh flowers on the newly turned soil. They barely looked up from their morning coffee. They waved me off with dismissive, eager nods, completely failing to hide their relief. They were absolutely thrilled to have the house to themselves so they could continue their plotting. But I did not drive to the cemetery. I drove downtown. I navigated the icy, congested city streets until I reached a towering glass building in the heart of the financial district. I parked my car in the underground garage and took the private elevator up to the 40th floor. The heavy brass plaque on the polished oak door read, "Jonathan Bradley, Trust and Estate Law." Jonathan was Martha's attorney. He was a legal shark in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, a man known throughout the city for tearing apart complex corporate litigations and protecting generational wealth with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. He greeted me with a firm, solid handshake and led me into his expansive corner office. The walls were lined with thick, leather-bound legal volumes. A breathtaking panoramic view of Lake Michigan stretched out behind his massive mahogany desk, the gray water matching the winter sky. He did not offer me empty condolences or soft words of comfort. He knew exactly why I was there. He sat across from me, steepled his fingers, and began to explain the sheer, calculating brilliance of the woman I had married. Martha knew Rachel was draining Derek's accounts. Jonathan said, his voice low and incredibly precise. She saw the designer clothes, the luxury cars, the constant endless demand for liquid cash. She knew Rachel would eventually come for your major assets when Derek ran completely dry. So exactly 1 year ago, your wife instructed me to build an impenetrable legal fortress around your most valuable property. Jonathan opened a thick manila folder and slid a copy of my property deed across the polished desk. The paper looked completely normal at first glance. "Look closely at the ownership line, Harrison," he instructed calmly. I put on my reading glasses and squinted at the fine print. The property was no longer registered in the name of Harrison and Martha Caldwell. It was registered to a corporate entity. It was an irrevocable blind trust. "You do not own that house anymore," Harrison Jonathan explained smoothly, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. "The trust owns it entirely. You are simply the primary beneficiary allowed to reside there until you pass away. Rachel and Derek think they can force you to sign a personal power of attorney to sell the property. They think they can just list it on the real estate market, take the cash from the unsuspecting buyer, and dump you in that cheap state-run facility. But here is the beautiful, devastating part of Martha's plan. Because you do not personally own the deed, any power of attorney you sign to sell the house is legally void. If they try to execute a sale using a fraudulent or forced signature under your personal name, they are not just committing simple elder abuse. They are attempting to defraud a federally registered trust. And the very moment they try to wire that buyer's money into their own personal bank accounts, they are committing federal wire fraud. That carries a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. They are essentially building their own prison brick by brick. I sat back in my chair, letting the massive magnitude of the trap wash over me. Martha had seen the end of her life approaching, and she had spent her final painful months digging a bottomless pit for our enemies to fall into. She knew Rachel would panic. She knew Rachel would try to liquidate the house quickly to cover her massive embezzlement before the auditors arrived. And she knew Derek was far too weak and compromised to stop her. But Jonathan leaned forward, his expression growing extremely serious. The relaxed confidence completely vanished from his face. The tension in the room suddenly spiked, making the quiet office feel incredibly small. "There is a significant catch, Harrison," he warned, his dark eyes locking intensely onto mine. "You have to play your part absolutely perfectly. You cannot show them any resistance whatsoever. You must let them bully you. You must let them force the pen into your trembling hand. If you fight back, if you show them you are mentally sharp and capable, Rachel will pivot her strategy. She will realize she cannot easily manipulate you into signing a power of attorney. If that happens, she will simply hire a corrupt medical professional to declare you medically unfit, and she will petition the state court for a forced conservatorship. If she gets a judge to grant her full legal guardianship over your life, she can tie up the trust funds in endless, exhausting litigation. She will drain the estate through legal fees just to save herself from the federal audit. You cannot let that happen." I nodded slowly, fully understanding the dangerous psychological game I was playing. "I have to be a helpless victim," I whispered, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I have to let them think they are completely breaking me down and winning." "Exactly," Jonathan said firmly, tapping his pen on the desk. "You have to endure their cruelty. You have to let them insult you, demean you, and treat you like garbage. You cannot break character for a single second, no matter how much it hurts. When the notary arrives to witness the signature, you must act exactly like a confused, frightened old man signing away his entire life. We need them to take the bait completely. We need them to initiate the fraudulent wire transfer without a single doubt in their minds. The second they do, the trap snaps shut forever, and the federal authorities will take over." I took a long, deep breath, steeling my nerves for the upcoming battle. I had survived decades on grueling, dangerous engineering sites. I had survived the agonizing, soul-crushing loss of my beloved wife. I could certainly survive a few more days of my daughter-in-law's pathetic, desperate, emotional abuse. I looked at Jonathan and told him I was completely ready. I told him I would walk right into their slaughterhouse with a vacant smile on my face. As I sat in Jonathan's quiet, secure office, going over the final legal preparations and reviewing the timeline for the fake buyer, my cell phone suddenly vibrated violently inside my coat pocket. It was a sharp, jarring sensation that broke the heavy silence of the room. I pulled the device out and looked at the bright screen. It was a push notification from the security application Bill had installed for me. It was a high-priority motion alert. The alert was coming directly from the camera hidden inside the air purifier in my home office. I tapped the notification immediately, and the live video feed filled my screen. I held the phone up so Jonathan could see it as well. The high-definition camera showed the interior of my private study back at the house. The room was usually kept locked, a quiet sanctuary where I kept my personal files, financial records, and Martha's old photo albums. But the door was wide open now. Rachel was inside my office. She was not acting like a grieving relative, and she was certainly not acting like a concerned caregiver organizing paperwork. She was moving with frantic, terrifying aggression. I watched in absolute silence as she tore through my heavy oak desk. She yanked the wooden drawers open so hard they nearly fell off their metal tracks. She grabbed thick handfuls of my personal documents, bank statements, old tax returns, and medical records, tossing them carelessly onto the hardwood floor, like garbage. She was ripping my entire life apart, searching frantically for the one thing she desperately needed to save herself from a devastating federal prison sentence. The audio feed from the hidden microphone was crystal clear. I could hear her heavy, panicked breathing echoing in the small room. I could hear the violent rustle of paper as she aggressively flipped through file folders, discarding anything that did not serve her immediate frantic purpose. She slammed a lower drawer shut with brutal force, making the camera lens vibrate slightly from the impact. She placed her hands firmly on her hips, staring down at the chaotic mess she had made of my sacred space. Her face was contorted into an ugly, desperate snarl, her perfectly crafted mask completely slipping away when she thought no one was watching. She kicked a stack of white envelopes across the room, completely losing whatever thin veneer of sanity she had left. "Where is the damn deed?" she muttered viciously to herself, her voice dripping with pure venom and mounting panic. "Where are you hiding it, you stupid old man?" I turned my phone screen away, a cold numbness spreading through my chest as I watched her frantically toss my personal files across the floor. Jonathan remained perfectly still behind his heavy mahogany desk, his dark eyes studying my reaction. He did not need to ask what I had just seen. The heavy silence in the office spoke volumes. I thanked him for his time, quietly folded the trust documents back into my leather satchel, and left the towering glass building. The crisp Chicago wind bit at my face as I walked back to my car, but the chill was nothing compared to the ice running through my veins. Rachel was desperate, moving with the chaotic, reckless energy of a cornered animal. I needed to know exactly why she was tearing my sanctuary apart. I needed to understand the meaning behind that terrifying text message about a federal audit and $2.5 million. I did not drive back to the house. Instead, I immediately dialed Bill from my car Bluetooth system and told him to meet me at the warehouse. When I arrived at the decaying industrial park, Bill was already there, pulling open the rusted corrugated metal door. The glowing fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as we stepped into the makeshift war room Martha had meticulously assembled. I walked straight to the long metal table in the center of the room and tossed my phone down, displaying a screenshot of the text message I had intercepted from Derek's phone. Bill stared at the glowing image, his retired investigator instincts instantly kicking into high gear. He pulled out a sleek encrypted laptop from his satchel, connected it to a secure mobile hotspot, and began typing with furious precision. He told me that medical finance executives like Rachel left vast digital footprints, and if a federal audit was looming over her head, the evidence would be hiding somewhere in the dark corners of her financial history. For 3 grueling hours, I sat in the drafty warehouse drinking terrible instant coffee, while Bill dug through public records, shell company registrations, and offshore account logs. The silence in the room was only broken by the rhythmic, aggressive clacking of his keyboard. Finally, he stopped. He let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed his tired eyes before turning the laptop screen toward me. "You need to brace yourself for this, Harrison Bill," said his voice stripped of all emotion. "Rachel is not the successful, high-powered medical finance executive she pretends to be. She is a profound, high-stakes online gambling addict." I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the sheer volume of numbers cascading down the spreadsheet. Bill explained that Rachel had been funneling massive amounts of money into offshore betting syndicates for the past 4 years. She had completely drained her personal savings, then moved on to liquidating her own retirement accounts. And finally, when the losses became insurmountable, she began manipulating the accounting software at her medical supply firm. "She has been actively embezzling company funds," Bill continued, pointing to a series of heavily encrypted wire transfers. "She created phantom vendors and authorized massive payments to shell corporations she secretly controlled. The total amount missing from her employer is exactly $2.5 million. The company is scheduled for a comprehensive mandatory federal audit in exactly 1 month. If she does not quietly replace that stolen money before the auditors open the books, she will be exposed. Embezzling that amount of money across state lines is a massive federal crime. She is looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The realization slammed into me with the force of a freight train. The puzzle pieces locked together with terrifying clarity. Rachel was not pushing me into a cheap nursing home because she was a greedy daughter-in-law looking for an early inheritance. She was desperately trying to stay out of federal prison. My house, appraised at $1.2 million, was the only physical asset large enough to keep her from spending the next decade and a half behind bars. She was using my life, my home, and my dignity as a sacrificial life raft to save herself from drowning in her own catastrophic failures. I leaned back in the cold metal folding chair, pressing the heels of my hands against my temples. A sickening thought suddenly clawed its way to the surface of my mind. Derek. Did my son know about the embezzlement? Did he know his wife was a federal criminal? Or was he just a pathetic, manipulated pawn in her desperate survival strategy? I needed the answer, even though I knew it would likely destroy whatever remaining affection I held for my child. I pulled out my phone and accessed the secure cloud storage linked to the hidden cameras I had installed the previous night. I scrolled through the motion-triggered video clips until I found a file recorded just an hour ago in my living room. I pressed play. The high-definition footage showed Derek pacing frantically back and forth across the hardwood floor. He looked absolutely terrified. His face was pale, his tie was loosened, and he was running his trembling hands through his hair repeatedly. Rachel was sitting on the velvet sofa, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her expression completely hardened. "I cannot do this, Rachel," Derek stammered on the recording, his voice cracking with panic. "He is my father. We cannot just dump him in Shady Pines and steal his house. It is fundamentally wrong. We are going to get caught. We cannot just forge his signature on a power of attorney and sell the property out from under him. He is grieving, not stupid." Rachel stood up abruptly, closing the distance between them. She did not offer him comfort. She grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive shirt and shook him violently. "We do not have a choice, Derek," she hissed, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper. "The auditors are coming next month. Do you understand what that means? If I do not put that $2.5 million back into the corporate accounts, I am going to prison. And you will be going down with me as an accessory because you knew about the phantom vendors and you did absolutely nothing to stop it." I stopped breathing. The cold air in the warehouse suddenly felt entirely suffocating. Derek knew. My own son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of my strength, knew his wife had stolen millions of dollars. Instead of forcing her to turn herself in, instead of standing up for what was right, he had actively chosen to help her hide the crime. And when they ran out of options, he had actively agreed to sacrifice me to save themselves. On the screen, Derek began to cry. Deep, pathetic, gasping sobs that shook his entire body. He sank down onto the coffee table, burying his face in his hands. "I cannot bear to watch him shuffle around here looking so sad." Derek wept. "Mom just died. He is so broken. And now we are taking his home. We are taking the house he built for us. It is evil, Rachel. We are truly evil people." Any lingering hope I had that Derek was simply an ignorant victim evaporated into thin air. He knew exactly how wicked their plan was. He fully understood the immense pain he was inflicting upon me. He recognized his own evil, but his cowardice and his fear of prison were vastly stronger than his love for his father. He was choosing to ruin my final years rather than face the consequences of his own complicity. Rachel looked down at her sobbing husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She did not see a partner. She saw an obstacle. She slapped her hand hard against the wooden table, making Derek flinch violently. "Stop crying right now," she snapped, her voice devoid of any human warmth. "Your tears are not going to pay back the corporate accounts. Your guilt is not going to stop the federal auditors from knocking on our door. We need that $1.2 million from this house to cover the initial deficit, and we need it immediately. So wipe your face, pull yourself together, and just get the old man to sign the power of attorney by Friday, or you will be visiting me behind glass for the next 15 years. The video clip ended, leaving the screen frozen on Rachel's furious, desperate face. I sat in the dark warehouse, staring at the black mirror of my phone. The silence was absolute. Bill did not say a single word to me. He simply closed his laptop and waited for me to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My son was fully complicit. He was not a victim. He was a willing participant in my destruction. The drive back from the warehouse was a blur of cold calculation. I had shed the last remnants of my paternal grief, replacing it with the clinical precision of an engineer designing a demolition. I walked through the front door of my home just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the bare oak trees. Rachel and Derek were sitting in the living room, their eyes fixed on a thick stack of legal documents resting on the coffee table. I immediately slipped back into the skin of the fragile, disoriented widower. I shuffled slowly into the room, letting my feet drag heavily against the hardwood floor. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law, allowing a soft, vacant smile to spread across my face. I walked toward her with my arms slightly outstretched, my hands trembling with perfectly practiced weakness. "Martha," I said, making my voice sound reedy and desperately relieved. "Oh, Martha, you are finally awake. I have been waiting for you to come downstairs all morning. I made your tea exactly the way you like it." Rachel recoiled violently, her face twisting into a mask of pure horror. She physically backed away from me, bumping into the sofa. "I am not Martha," she snapped, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of patience. "Your wife is dead. We buried her last week. You need to snap out of this right now." I let my arms drop to my sides, blinking rapidly, as if fighting through a dense fog. "I apologize," I mumbled, lowering my head submissively. "My eyes are just so tired today." I shuffled toward the kitchen, leaning heavily against the wall for support. Derek watched me with wide eyes, clearly unnerved by my performance. 10 minutes later, I returned to the living room carrying a ceramic mug filled to the brim with scalding hot black coffee. Rachel was bent over the coffee table, furiously arranging a preliminary real estate listing agreement. I stumbled forward, intentionally catching the toe of my slipper on the edge of the woven area rug. I pitched forward, letting the heavy ceramic mug slip from my grasp. The hot, dark liquid splashed violently across the table, completely soaking the pristine white documents. Rachel let out a piercing shriek, scrambling backward to save her slacks from the spreading brown stain. I stood there, wringing my hands together in an exaggerated display of pathetic, helpless guilt. "I am so clumsy," I whimpered, watching the ink run and blur across the ruined pages. "I am so sorry. My hands just do not work the way they used to." Rachel was vibrating with fury. She grabbed a handful of paper towels and began aggressively scrubbing at the ruined documents, cursing under her breath. She was unraveling right in front of me, her anxiety over the impending federal audit stretching her nerves to the absolute breaking point. I was systematically dismantling her composure, forcing her to expend precious mental energy, dealing with an unpredictable, senile old man. As the day wore on, her desperation mutated into a sharp, vicious cruelty. Later that afternoon, Derek left the house to pick up dinner, leaving the two of us alone in the silent house. I was sitting in my worn recliner, staring blankly out the front window. Rachel walked slowly into the room and stood directly over me. She leaned down, bringing her face inches from mine. She smelled of expensive perfume and stale, anxious sweat. "You are a pathetic burden, Harrison," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing but a hollowed-out shell taking up space. You belong in a soiled diaper, rotting away in some forgotten facility where the nurses do not even know your name. That is exactly where you are going." I did not flinch. I did not break character. I simply looked up at her and offered a soft, utterly vacant smile, absorbing every single vicious insult she hurled at me. I let her believe her words were piercing my soul, when in reality they were merely confirming her complete lack of humanity. She scoffed at my silent, smiling response, turning on her heel and marching back into the kitchen. As soon as she was out of sight, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I opened my encrypted messaging application and typed a quick, decisive text to Jonathan Bradley. "They are desperate enough. Send the bait." I hit send and slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling the cold weight of the trap finally locking into place. Jonathan moved with terrifying speed. Within an hour, Rachel's cell phone began to ring endlessly. Jonathan had utilized one of his corporate contacts to act as a highly motivated real estate buyer. I sat in my chair listening closely as Rachel paced the hallway, her voice rising in pitch as she spoke to the fake buyer on the phone. Jonathan's proxy was executing the script flawlessly. The buyer was offering 20% above the current market value of the house, demanding a quick all-cash close. The catch, however, was that the buyer insisted on an expedited timeline, claiming they needed to secure the property for an international executive relocating within the week. The offer was an absolute miracle for a desperate embezzler facing a federal audit. It was the perfect solution to all of her terrifying problems, wrapped in a bow and handed to her on a silver platter. I could hear the manic, unrestrained joy in Rachel's voice as she agreed to every single term the buyer laid out. She was blinded by her own greed and her paralyzing fear of prison. She did not stop to question why a wealthy buyer would bypass standard inspections. She only saw the escape hatch opening in front of her. The sun set rapidly, plunging the house into winter darkness. Derek returned with the food, and the two of them huddled in the kitchen, speaking in rapid, hushed tones. They were moving into the final stage of their plan. They needed my signature immediately to secure the fraudulent sale. I remained in my recliner, playing the part of the exhausted, declining elder, while my mind raced with razor-sharp focus. Every hidden camera in the house was recording. Every piece of digital evidence was safely stored in Bill's secure cloud. The stage was perfectly set. At exactly 10 o'clock at night, the heavy silence of the house was shattered by the ringing of the front doorbell. Derek flinched visibly, but Rachel practically sprinted to the entryway. I turned my head slightly, watching as she opened the door to reveal a tall, imposing man wearing a cheap suit and carrying a battered leather briefcase. He was a shady, off-the-books notary public for hire. Rachel led him into the dining room and marched directly over to my chair. She grabbed my arm, her grip bruising, and hauled me to my feet. She shoved me toward the dining room table, pulling a thick stack of legal papers from her folder and slamming them down onto the polished wood. She slammed a heavy black pen down right next to the documents. "Time to sign, Dad." I slumped into the heavy oak dining chair, letting my shoulders collapse inward, as if the physical weight of the situation was crushing the breath from my lungs. The dining room, usually a place of warmth and family gatherings, felt entirely sterile and foreign. The overhead chandelier cast a harsh, unforgiving light across the polished wood, illuminating the thick stack of legal documents Rachel had just slammed down in front of me. The notary public stood awkwardly on the opposite side of the table. He was a sweating man who smelled faintly of cheap cologne and stale tobacco. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer a polite greeting or extend a professional courtesy. He merely opened his battered leather briefcase, pulling out a heavy metal stamp and a worn ink pad. In any legitimate legal proceeding, a notary is obligated to verify the identity of the signatory and ensure the individual is of sound mind. This man did none of that. He did not ask to see my identification. He did not look me in the eye. He simply tapped a thick, calloused finger against the bottom of the first page, indicating the blank signature line. Rachel stood behind my chair, hovering over my shoulder like a starving vulture. I looked down at the heavy black pen resting on the table. My heart maintained a steady rhythm, but I forced my body to portray absolute terror. I reached out for the pen, commanding my hand to shake violently. My fingers trembled with such intense manufactured weakness that my knuckles knocked against the table. I managed to grasp the thick plastic barrel of the pen, lifting it awkwardly toward the document, but I intentionally let my grip falter. The pen slipped through my trembling fingers and clattered against the hardwood floor, rolling under the table. A tense, suffocating silence immediately filled the dining room. Rachel let out a sharp hiss of annoyance. She dropped to her knees, snatching the pen off the floor. She stood back up and practically shoved the pen directly into my open palm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging painfully into my fragile skin. "Sign the paper, Harrison," she commanded, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, devoid of fake compassion. "We do not have all night to wait for you to figure out how to use a simple writing instrument. The state facility needs this documentation processed by tomorrow morning so they can secure your bed." I kept my head bowed, staring blankly at the thick black ink forming the legal clauses of the power of attorney. The document was designed to grant Rachel and Derek absolute unrestricted control over my finances, my medical decisions, and most importantly, the physical deed to the $1 million home we were currently standing inside. I slowly lifted my head, bypassing Rachel completely, and shifted my vacant, watery gaze directly toward my son. Derek was standing near the entryway leading into the kitchen. He had positioned himself as far away from the dining room table as physically possible without leaving the room. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his shoulders hunched, his eyes glued firmly to the Persian rug. He looked like a frightened, guilty child, unable to bear the weight of his own monstrous actions. I let out a soft, raspy breath, forcing my lower lip to quiver pathetically. "Derek," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail and laced with profound, manufactured confusion. "Derek, please just look at me." It took him a long, agonizing moment, but he finally dragged his eyes upward to meet mine. His face was entirely drained of color, his skin a sickly pale gray under the bright chandelier. "Are you absolutely sure this is what your mother wanted?" I asked, letting my voice crack perfectly on the final word. "I just want to make sure Martha would be okay with all of this. I just want to make her proud." The silence in the dining room became so thick and oppressive, it felt like a physical weight pressing down against my skull. I watched my son closely searching the very depths of his eyes for any lingering trace of the decent, honest boy Martha and I had raised. I looked for a flicker of genuine remorse, a sudden surge of moral clarity, or even just the basic human courage to stop this horrific train before it completely derailed. But there was absolutely nothing left inside him. The gambling debts, the terror of a federal audit, and his total submission to Rachel's manipulative cruelty had completely hollowed him out. Derek swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. He looked directly into my eyes, effectively severing our sacred, lifelong bond in a single devastating moment. "Yes, Dad." Derek lied, his voice hollow and trembling with cowardice. "This is exactly what Mom wanted for you. It is for your own good." I held his gaze for 3 full seconds, absorbing the absolute magnitude of his betrayal. The last remaining shred of my paternal grief instantly died, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of an executioner. He had made his final choice. He had chosen the parasite over his own flesh and blood. I broke eye contact and looked back down at the fraudulent document. I gripped the heavy black pen tightly, intentionally pressing the tip against the paper with just enough force to make the ink bleed slightly. I slowly, deliberately signed my full name across the dotted line, ensuring my handwriting appeared shaky and incredibly fragile. I flipped to the second page and signed again, then the third. With every single stroke of the pen, I was handing them the exact legal rope they would inevitably use to hang themselves. I was giving them the fraudulent instrument that would trigger federal wire fraud the moment they attempted to execute the real estate sale. I finished the final signature and let the pen drop softly onto the table. Before I could even pull my hand away, Rachel lunged forward. She snatched the thick stack of papers off the polished wood so incredibly fast she nearly tore the corner of the final poem. A victorious, manic gleam illuminated her eyes as she quickly handed the documents to the sweating notary. The man stamped the pages with his seal, scribbled his illegible signature across the bottom, and shoved the paperwork into his briefcase. He did not say a word. He simply turned on his heel and walked rapidly toward the front door, eager to escape the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the house. Rachel and Derek immediately followed him into the entryway, murmuring their hushed, relieved thanks as they prepared to lock the door behind him. The moment their backs were completely turned, I slowly stood up from the dining room chair. The frail, trembling posture instantly vanished, replaced by a rigid, commanding stillness. My hands were completely steady. I turned my head slightly, looking directly into the dark ventilation slit of the air purifier, where I had hidden the microcamera. I gave the tiny lens a single cold, sharp nod. The trap was now finally and officially armed. My fingers fumbled with my smartphone, scrubbing the playback slider back to the beginning of her confession. I needed to hear it again. I pushed myself up from the bed and stumbled blindly into the master bathroom. I pushed the wooden door shut, turned the brass lock until it clicked and sank onto the cold tile floor. I pressed the earbud deeper into my ear canal and hit play. The audio looped endlessly, a continuous nightmare burning into my soul. The medication swap worked perfectly. She just drifted off to sleep. Rachel's slurred, arrogant voice echoed in the darkness. She was boasting about silencing a brilliant woman. Martha had spent her entire life protecting her family, and in her final weeks, she was deliberately trapped in a chemically induced fog by the very people she nurtured. I closed my eyes, and the memories of Martha's last month rushed back with agonizing clarity. I remembered sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, begging her to speak. I assumed the decline in her cognitive abilities was the progression of her terminal illness. The hospice nurses had been confused by her extreme lethargy, but Rachel stepped in, waving her fake medical credentials, assuring the staff that the prescribed morphine drip was functioning as intended. But it was not just morphine. Rachel introduced heavy, unprescribed sedatives into my wife's daily regimen. She systematically replaced the pain medication with chemical restraints, keeping Martha too sedated to utter a single coherent sentence. Rachel knew Martha possessed a brilliant mind. She knew that if Martha had retained even a fraction of her lucidity, she would have contacted Jonathan Bradley to expose the embezzlement and sever Derek from the vast fortune hidden in the blind trust. Rachel had to ensure Martha could never make that final phone call. She stole my wife's final words. She stole our final goodbye. She robbed me of the chance to hear Martha's voice one last time to guarantee a smooth path to liquidate this house. The sheer, unadulterated evil of her actions was incomprehensible, but it was the next voice on the recording that truly shattered the foundation of my reality. Derek, my son. The boy I taught to throw a baseball in the backyard. The young man whose tuition I paid by working double shifts on freezing construction sites. His voice trembled through the speaker, a pathetic, desperate attempt to justify the unforgivable. "We did not kill her, Rachel," Derek pleaded on the recording, his tone thick with cowardly rationalization. "You have to stop saying it like that. The cancer killed her. She was already dying. We just kept her quiet. We just made sure she was comfortable and quiet." He knew. My own son knew exactly what his wife was doing to his dying mother. He stood in that bedroom, looking down at the woman who gave him life, watching her slip away into an artificial coma, and he did nothing to stop it. He watched her mind be systematically erased by illicit sedatives and actively participated in the cover-up. He traded his mother's final moments of dignity for real estate. He traded her voice for the desperate hope of avoiding a federal audit. He traded his soul to appease the vicious parasite he married. The horrifying reality of his complicity washed over me, a suffocating wave that threatened to pull me under entirely. He was not a victim of Rachel's manipulation. He was a willing participant in a slow, agonizing execution. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time, the cold seeping through the tiles into my bones. The audio recording finished and restarted again, but I did not stop it. I let their voices fill my head, allowing the full weight of their absolute depravity to crush whatever lingering illusions I still held. I thought about the man I had been just 24 hours ago. I had been a father trying to teach a harsh, necessary lesson. I had been a man focused on securing his assets, outsmarting a greedy daughter-in-law, and perhaps finding a way to salvage a fractured relationship with his son. I believed that if I simply trapped them in their own financial fraud, if I let the federal wire charges stick, it would be enough. I thought I was delivering tough love. I thought I was handing down a painful but justifiable consequence for their extreme greed. But that man was dead. That forgiving, hopeful father died the exact second Derek justified his mother's chemical imprisonment. Any trace of paternal instinct, any fragment of mercy, completely evaporated from my heart. I was no longer trying to protect my money. I was no longer trying to outmaneuver them in a clever legal game of chess. This was no longer about real estate blind trusts or fake corporate buyers. This was about absolute scorched earth vengeance. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had taken Martha from me before her time. They had violated the sanctity of our home and the sacred bond of our family in the most grotesque manner conceivable. I felt a profound, terrifying calmness settle over my mind. It was the absolute clarity of a man who no longer has anything left to lose, a man who has fully accepted his new devastating purpose. I was going to tear their lives apart brick by brick. I was going to ensure their punishment was so inescapable that they would spend the rest of their miserable lives begging for an end that would never come. I slowly pushed myself up from the cold bathroom floor. My joints popped in the quiet room, but I felt stronger than I had in years. I walked over to the porcelain sink and turned on the brass faucet, splashing freezing water onto my face. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The sad, broken widower was gone. The confused old man they thought they were manipulating had vanished completely. The eyes staring back at me were hard dark and utterly ruthless. I reached for a thick white towel, dried my face meticulously, and pulled my phone back out of my pocket. I checked the digital clock resting at the top of the screen. It was exactly 3 a.m. The neighborhood was completely silent, buried under a thick blanket of winter frost. But I knew Bill would answer. He was an old investigator. His instincts never truly slept. I bypassed my standard contacts list and dialed his encrypted secondary number. The line clicked and connected after only 2 short rings. Harrison Bill answered, his voice instantly alert, lacking any trace of grogginess. "What is wrong? Did they try something?" I kept my voice low, speaking in a steady whisper, so the sound would not carry through the bedroom walls. "I need you to wake up, Bill," I said, my tone entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "I need you to reach out to your old contacts immediately." "What did you find?" he asked, the professional edge sharpening his words. "They did not just isolate me, Bill." I told him, gripping the edge of the bathroom sink so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. Rachel swapped Martha's prescribed pain medication for heavy, unprescribed sedatives during her final month. She purposely kept my wife in a drug-induced fog so she could not alter the blind trust or talk to me privately. And Derek knew. He watched her do it, and he helped her cover it up. They chemically restrained her until she died. A heavy, terrible silence fell over the encrypted line. I could hear Bill taking a sharp, deep breath on the other end. "Call your contacts at the coroner's office," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, uncompromising whisper. "I know it has been weeks, but you have to find a way. Pull Martha's final toxicology report. I need documented, irrefutable medical proof of exactly what chemicals Rachel put into her system. I need the exact dosages and the timelines." "I am on it, Harrison," Bill replied instantly, his voice thick with a dark, matching anger. "I will call the chief medical examiner at his home right now. He owes me a massive favor from our insurance fraud days. What else do you need me to do?" "Call Jonathan Bradley, as soon as the sun comes up." I instructed, my eyes locked on my cold reflection in the mirror. "Tell him the situation has fundamentally escalated. Tell him to completely alter the timeline for the fake corporate buyer. We need to push the closing date up to tomorrow afternoon. We need to force them to execute that fraudulent power of attorney while they are still drunk on their own arrogance. And Bill, yes, Harrison, tell Jonathan the entire plan has changed." I said the words slipping out with lethal, absolute certainty. "We are not just taking their stolen money anymore. We are burying them, The following week dragged by with agonizing slowness, each day a masterclass in psychological endurance. The house officially went under contract with Jonathan Bradley's proxy buyer, moving through the necessary legal motions with the terrifying speed Rachel so desperately required. The fake buyer waived every standard contingency, ignored the need for structural inspections, and promised a finalized all-cash transfer within 14 days. Rachel was practically vibrating with a manic, unrestrained glee. She walked through the hallways of my home, with her head held high, mentally measuring the spaces, already spending the millions she believed were just days away from hitting her secret offshore accounts. She even brought home glossy brochures for luxury European vacations, leaving them scattered carelessly across the kitchen counter for me to see. I had only a few days left in the house before my supposed forced transfer to Shady Pines commenced later this very week. I spent those miserable days meticulously packing a single battered canvas suitcase, filling it with frayed sweaters and old slacks, playing the part of the defeated patriarch being marched to the end of his life. Derek actively avoided my gaze entirely. He left for work early and returned late, locking himself in the guest bedroom whenever I shuffled into the hallway. The guilt was clearly eating him alive, but his cowardice remained the dominant force in his hollow soul. He was watching his own father prepare for a miserable exile, yet he said absolutely nothing to stop the impending disaster. I absorbed their cruelty in total silence, offering only vacant stares and pathetic trembling nods whenever Rachel barked a command at me to stay out of her way. The performance was physically and emotionally exhausting, requiring a level of iron discipline I did not know I possessed inside of me. I was holding a lit match over a massive barrel of gasoline, just waiting for the exact right moment to officially drop it. By Thursday evening, Rachel had literally packed my bags for me. I watched in silent, detached disgust as she shoved my belongings into the canvas suitcase. She zipped it shut with a sharp, forceful tug and hauled it down the stairs, dropping it unceremoniously right by the front door. It sat there like a physical monument to my impending exile. She had also confirmed the transportation. A sterile white passenger van from Shady Pines Assisted Living was officially scheduled to arrive at the house at exactly 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. They were going to sign the closing papers at the real estate office downtown, secure the wire transfer, and then I would simply be hauled away forever. They believed they had achieved an ultimate flawless victory. The final morning arrived with a bleak, freezing winter rain lashing against the kitchen windows. The house was incredibly cold, but I barely registered the dropping temperature. I shuffled into the kitchen shortly after 8 o'clock, wearing my oldest, most frayed gray sweater, perfectly maintaining the illusion of the broken, helpless widower. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, a stark contrast to the toxic, heavy atmosphere suffocating the house. Rachel was standing near the marble kitchen island, completely transformed. The anxious, panicked woman from the hidden camera footage was permanently gone. In her place stood a triumphant, excessively arrogant financial predator. She was dressed in a sharp, incredibly expensive charcoal designer suit, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup totally flawless. She looked like a woman preparing to finally conquer the world, entirely ignorant of the massive, invisible legal guillotine currently hanging directly over her foolish head today. She turned and immediately saw me standing near the wooden doorway. She did not offer a polite greeting. She did not ask if I had slept well overnight. Instead, she flashed a patronizing, sickeningly sweet smile that made my stomach physically turn. She walked over to the counter and picked up her leather portfolio, the one containing the fraudulent power of attorney I had signed just days prior. "Do not worry, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with artificial syrupy comfort. "The nurses at the facility are very nice. They will undoubtedly take excellent care of you." I noticed the subtle shift in her vocabulary instantly. She had completely dropped the fake, affectionate title of Dad. She no longer needed to pretend she viewed me as beloved family. I was just Harrison to her now, a pathetic obstacle she had successfully outmaneuvered, a temporary problem she had finally permanently solved. Derek was standing by the coffee maker, remaining completely silent. He had not said a single word since I entered the kitchen. He was wearing a dark navy suit, but it hung awkwardly on his frame as if he had physically shrunk overnight. The crushing weight of his guilt was eating him alive, gnawing at his bones, but his cowardice and his immense greed were infinitely stronger. He knew exactly what they had done to Martha. He knew they were intentionally destroying my entire life today. Yet he continued to stand by his wife, choosing the illusion of financial safety over his own flesh and blood. He poured a cup of black coffee, his hands shaking so violently that dark droplets spilled over the rim and splashed onto the pristine marble countertop. He took a shaky breath, turned around, and walked slowly toward me, holding the warm ceramic mug forward. Here he mumbled adamantly, refusing to lift his gaze above my chest level. "You should probably have something warm to drink before the facility van successfully gets here." I looked at the dark liquid trembling inside the cup in his weak hand. I thought about the chilling audio recording. I thought about Martha deliberately drifting into a permanent drug-induced coma while her own son stood by and simply watched. I did not hunch my tired shoulders. I did not let my hands shake. For the very first time in weeks, I dropped the pathetic act of the helpless, senile old man entirely. I straightened my spine, pulling myself up to my full height, and locked my eyes directly onto his pale face. "I do not need anything from you anymore, Derek," I said firmly. My voice was not frail. It was exceptionally low, incredibly steady, and very dangerously sharp. Derek froze, completely dropping his facade. The coffee cup trembled harder in his hands, nearly spilling again. He finally lifted his head and met my eyes, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, I saw absolute, unadulterated panic completely register across his face. Before his mind could fully process the massive implications, Rachel called out sharply from the front hallway. "Derek, let us go," she barked impatiently. "The title agent is expecting us, and we cannot be late for the wire transfer today. Leave him be. The transport van knows exactly what to do." The spell was finally broken. Derek placed the coffee mug down, grabbed his coat, and hurried away. I listened to the front door slam shut, followed by their car speeding off. Exactly 10 minutes later, a sleek black town car pulled into the driveway. Jonathan Bradley sat in the back seat. "Ready, Harrison?" he asked me very quietly. I nodded once, slipping into the leather interior of the vehicle as the heavy door thudded shut, sealing away the biting winter wind. I did not wear the frayed gray sweater my son and daughter-in-law had last seen me in. Beneath my heavy winter overcoat, I was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored black suit, a pristine white shirt, and a dark silk tie. It was the exact suit I had worn to board meetings during the peak of my architectural career, the armor of a man who commanded respect and ruthlessly dismantled his adversaries. Jonathan handed me a steaming cup of dark roast coffee, a stark contrast to the pathetic slop Derek had offered me earlier. He informed me his associate, acting as the motivated buyer's agent, was already in the room with them, preparing the final stages of the trap. We drove downtown in a heavy, focused silence, the rhythmic hum of the tires serving as the only soundtrack to our impending retribution. The sprawling financial district loomed ahead, a massive fortress of steel and glass, where Rachel genuinely believed she was about to finalize her salvation and secure her freedom forever. At that very moment, high above the city streets, Rachel and Derek were sitting inside a sleek, glass-walled conference room. Bill had tapped into the building's security feed, allowing Jonathan and me to monitor their progress from the back of the town car via a secure tablet. Rachel was perched eagerly on the edge of a leather executive chair, leaning her body weight over a massive mahogany conference table. The fraudulent power of attorney. The exact document she had ripped from my trembling hands 2 nights ago rested proudly in the direct center of the table. Across from her sat Jonathan's associate, a groomed man radiating the perfect blend of professional charm and transactional detachment. He slid a thick stack of property transfer documents across the polished wood, pointing a manicured finger to the yellow flags indicating exactly where their binding signatures were required by law. Rachel did not hesitate for a single second. She did not bother to read the dense legal text or review the binding clauses that outlined the massive transfer of wealth she was attempting to steal. She simply picked up a heavy silver pen and signed her name with a dramatic, aggressive flourish, her movements sharp and desperate. She shoved the paperwork toward Derek, tapping her manicured nail against the blank signature line until he slowly, reluctantly picked up the pen and signed his name beside hers. He looked physically ill, his posture slumped and defeated, but his inherent cowardice forced him to comply with her demands. The associate smoothly gathered the freshly signed documents, stacking them neatly, before tapping a few keys on his sleek silver laptop. He looked up at Rachel, offering a polite, practiced smile that revealed absolutely nothing of his true intentions or the trap closing around them. The wire transfer for $1.2 million has been officially initiated. Mrs. Caldwell, he stated in a smooth, perfectly even tone, the funds should clear our secure escrow account and reflect in your specified corporate receiving account within the hour. Rachel literally sighed in massive relief, a long, shuddering exhalation that caused her entire body to slump back into the leather chair. Her eyes fluttered closed for a brief, euphoric moment, a sickening smile of absolute triumph stretching across her flushed face. She truly believed she had beaten the looming federal audit that threatened her freedom. She believed she had successfully sacrificed her grieving father-in-law to expertly pave over her catastrophic corporate embezzlement. She believed she had outsmarted the entire world and won the ultimate game of financial survival. She was entirely and catastrophically wrong. Jonathan and I stepped out of the black town car, accompanied by two stern-faced FBI special agents we had rendezvoused with. We rode the private executive elevator up to the 50th floor in complete, devastating silence. The only sound was the soft mechanical hum of the elevator ascending higher into the sky. As we approached the designated conference room, I shrugged off my heavy winter overcoat, handing the thick wool garment silently to Jonathan. I straightened my dark silk tie and rolled my shoulders back officially, shedding the final lingering ghost of the frail, broken old man they thought they had permanently conquered. I felt a massive surge of cold, pure energy course through my veins, replacing my profound grief and sorrow with an unyielding thirst for absolute, undeniable retribution. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and pushed the heavy metal handles. The heavy glass doors of the conference room swung inward with a resounding, authoritative thud that instantly shattered the quiet, victorious atmosphere of the room. I walked in. I was not shuffling my feet against the carpet. I was not looking down at the floor. My posture was perfectly rigid, my gaze was completely lethal, and my footsteps echoed with the steady, measured cadence of an executioner finally arriving at the gallows. I was wearing a sharp, tailored black suit, projecting an aura of total, terrifying control. Jonathan stepped in immediately behind me, maintaining a strict professional distance. He was followed closely by the two federal agents, their dark suits and unmistakable gold badges, instantly draining all the remaining oxygen from the enclosed space. Rachel let out a sharp gasp, the heavy silver pen slipping from her trembling fingers and clattering onto the polished mahogany table. Her triumphant smile vanished in an instant, rapidly replaced by a twisted mask of pure shock and growing horror. She stared at me as if I were an impossible apparition, her mind failing to reconcile the imposing man standing before her with the weeping, helpless victim she had left sitting alone in the kitchen prior. Derek scrambled backward in sheer terror, his leather chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He stood up abruptly, his knees trembling against his tailored trousers, his face completely devoid of all natural color. He looked rapidly from me to Jonathan, and then to the grim faces of the federal agents purposefully blocking the exit. "Dad," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine that echoed off the glass walls. "What the hell are you doing here? You are supposed to be locked up at Shady Pines right now. The medical transport van was scheduled to pick you up." I did not answer his miserable, cowardly question immediately. I walked slowly and deliberately to the absolute head of the conference table, maintaining unwavering eye contact with the man who traded his mother's dignity for stolen real estate. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket, pulled out my smartphone, and placed it on the center of the wood surface. I quickly synced the device to the room's Bluetooth speaker system with a single tap of my index finger. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch endlessly across the large room until their absolute anxiety reached a visible breaking point. Then, looking directly into Rachel's terrified eyes with hatred, I calmly pressed play. The digital audio pierced the sterile silence of the downtown conference room. My smartphone amplified the recording, projecting Rachel's arrogant voice against the glass walls. "I honestly cannot believe we actually pulled this off," she bragged, slurred with champagne. The audio continued until it reached the moment that shattered my reality. "God, your mother was so unbelievably stubborn." The recording played venom slicing the air. The medication swap worked perfectly. She just drifted off to sleep. She never even had the clarity to call her lawyer or secure the assets. We handled her, and now we are handling him. I pressed the button on the screen, cutting the audio off abruptly. The silence that rushed back into the room was absolute and suffocating. It was the heavy silence of a complete reckoning. I stood at the head of the table, my posture rigid, my eyes locked onto the two monsters. The flush of victory on Rachel's face vanished entirely. The color violently drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a ghastly white. Her jaw hung slack, her lips parting to formulate a defense, but her vocal cords completely failed. She looked down at the dropped pen, then up at the federal agents frantically trying to process the catastrophic collapse of her world. She was paralyzed, a predator realizing she had walked into a steel trap. Derek reacted with sheer physical collapse. He fell back into his executive chair, hands flying up to grip his hair. He began to gasp, his chest heaving as rapid breaths racked his body. The weight of his guilt, the agonizing reality that his complicity in his mother's death was now public, finally crushed him. He stared at me with panicked eyes, completely unable to utter a single syllable of justification. "You thought you were incredibly clever," I said, my voice low and vibrating with righteous fury. "You genuinely believed my mind was deteriorating. You assumed my grief made me a pathetic obstacle you could sweep away into a state facility. But you miscalculated. You underestimated a husband's love, and you misunderstood the lengths a father will go to when his family is destroyed." Jonathan Bradley stepped forward from the shadows near the heavy glass doors, his presence commanding and entirely uncompromising. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and produced a thick, authenticated legal dossier, dropping it onto the center of the mahogany table directly next to my phone. "This property does not belong to Harrison Caldwell," Jonathan announced, his voice ringing with absolute legal authority. "This house and every single liquid asset associated with this estate was transferred into a secure, irrevocable blind trust 6 months ago, exactly as Martha Caldwell instructed before her cognitive decline. That document you just signed, the power of attorney you so desperately forced upon a man you believe to be legally incompetent, is not merely useless. It is a fraudulent instrument." Jonathan paused, letting the devastating reality settle over them like concrete. Furthermore, Jonathan continued, gesturing toward the associate sitting across the table, "The buyer you negotiated with does not exist. This entire transaction was a meticulously constructed mirage. The $1.2 million wire transfer you just authorized and attempted to accept was bait for a federal sting operation. By signing those documents and transmitting that financial request across state lines, you have just committed textbook federal wire fraud." Rachel let out a low, strangled gasp, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Derek moaned, burying his face completely in his trembling hands. But the demolition was not even close to being finished. The two FBI special agents stepped forward, their movements synchronized and deeply intimidating. The taller agent, a man with cold, unyielding eyes, addressed Rachel directly. "Rachel Caldwell, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud," he stated, his voice a flat mechanical drone that offered zero sympathy. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "But that is just the beginning of your legal problems tonight. We are also acting on a highly detailed anonymous tip provided to the board of directors at your medical supply firm. Our financial division has spent the last 48 hours tracking a series of encrypted offshore wire transfers. We have complete documentation regarding the $2.5 million you actively embezzled using phantom vendors. Rachel shook her head frantically, tears spilling over her eyelashes. No, she stammered, her voice a pathetic whisper. You cannot do this. It was a mistake. I was going to pay it back. I was going to put the money right back into the accounts today. The second agent stepped up beside his partner, his expression even darker. And finally, the agent said, cutting off her pathetic rationalizations, we are opening an immediate joint investigation with local homicide detectives and the district attorney's office. We have initiated a formal inquiry into the death of Martha Caldwell. Based on the audio evidence provided and the newly acquired toxicology reports secured from the county medical examiner just hours ago, you are the primary suspect in a case of severe elder abuse, unauthorized chemical restraint, and medical tampering resulting in wrongful death. The words hung in the air, sealing their absolute doom. There was no escape hatch. There were no more lies left to spin. I had systematically dismantled every single pillar of their miserable lives, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own wicked choices. They had traded their humanity for greed, and now they were going to pay the ultimate price. The taller agent grabbed Rachel's wrist, twisting her arm behind her back, with practiced, unyielding force. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her wrists, the metallic ratcheting sound echoing sharply through the quiet conference room. The reality of her situation finally snapped her fragile mind. Rachel threw her head back and screamed. It was not a cry for help. It was a feral, ugly, guttural sound of pure terror. It was the sound of a cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut on its own neck. She thrashed against the agents, kicking her expensive heels against the mahogany table, but they held her with absolute, unwavering control. Derek watched his wife being restrained, his eyes wide and completely vacant. The cowardice that had defined his miserable existence finally consumed him entirely. He slid out of the leather executive chair, dropping heavily to his knees on the carpeted floor. He ignored the federal agents. He ignored the screaming woman he had married. He crawled awkwardly across the floor, closing the distance between us until he was directly at my feet. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the hem of my tailored suit pants. Dad, he sobbed, tears and snot streaming down his pale face. Dad, please. You have to stop this. I am your son. I am your boy. You cannot let them take me away. I did not do it. She made me do it. She told me we would lose everything. Please, Dad, I am begging you. Have mercy on me. Please, just have mercy. I stared down at the 38-year-old man groveling on the floor of the glass-enclosed conference room. The pristine mahogany table, the breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago city skyline, and the impeccably dressed federal agents all stood in stark, jarring contrast to the pathetic, crumbling figure weeping violently at my expensive leather shoes. Derek clung to the fine fabric of my tailored trousers with white-knuckled desperation. He looked entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, dismissive son who had spent the last several weeks treating me like a burdensome ghost in my own home. Now stripped of his stolen authority and facing the absolute certainty of a federal prison cell, he was frantically attempting to wield our biological connection as a final desperate shield against the catastrophic consequences of his own monumental greed. Dad, please. He choked out his voice, a wet, ragged gasp that echoed pitifully against the soundproof glass. I am your son. I am your blood. You are my father. You cannot just let them take me away like this. I will do anything you ask. I will fix it. Just please do not let them take me. I did not flinch. I did not step back, nor did I reach down to offer him the comforting, forgiving embrace he was so frantically seeking. I simply stood there, a towering pillar of absolute icy resolve, looking down at him with zero trace of emotion. The profound paternal grief that had threatened to crush my chest only a few short days ago, had been entirely eradicated, burned away by the blistering truth of his complicity in Martha's death. I let the silence stretch for a long, punishing moment, ensuring that the finality of my upcoming words would pierce straight through his cowardly soul and resonate for the rest of his miserable life. "My blood died the night you stood by and let that vicious parasite drug your mother to death," I stated. My voice was completely level, lacking even the slightest hint of a tremor. I did not need to yell. The quiet, surgical precision of my delivery was far more devastating than any raised volume could ever achieve. You watched the woman who gave you life be chemically imprisoned in her own bed, and you did absolutely nothing. You traded her final moments of clarity for stolen real estate and offshore bank accounts. I paused, letting his quiet, pathetic sobbing fill the space between us before delivering the final, crushing blow. "The federal penitentiary is the absolute cheapest nursing home I could possibly find for you, Derek. Enjoy the amenities. I hear the beds are considerably less comfortable than the ones waiting at Shady Pines." With a single sharp motion, I pulled my leg back physically, tearing the hem of my trousers from his desperate, sweaty grasp. Derek collapsed completely onto the carpeted floor, curling into a tight, trembling ball of unadulterated misery. He wailed a high, piercing sound of ultimate defeat. The federal agents immediately stepped forward to finish their job. The taller agent hauled Derek up by his armpits, securing his wrists behind his back in a swift, practiced motion. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked into place, matching the restraints already securing his horrified wife. Rachel, having momentarily recovered from her initial paralysis, erupted into a state of absolute feral rage. She thrashed violently against the firm grip of the second agent, her perfectly styled hair falling in chaotic, frantic strands across her pale face. She screamed horrific, venomous curses at me, her voice echoing shrilly against the thick glass walls. She called me a monster, a manipulative old devil, swearing that she would find a way to destroy me even from behind bars. Derek, meanwhile, sobbed hysterically, his head hanging low, completely unable to watch the total disintegration of his stolen empire. I did not look back at them. I did not offer a final glance of pity or a parting word of advice. I slowly raised my hands and adjusted the knot of my dark silk tie, smoothing the lapels of my suit jacket with deliberate calm. I turned toward Jonathan Bradley, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with grim, quiet satisfaction. I offered him a firm, decisive nod. I thanked him sincerely for his flawless execution of the proxy buyer ruse, acknowledging the masterful legal strategy that had brought this exact moment to fruition. Without waiting for a response from the furious woman being dragged away, I turned on my heel and walked purposefully out of the conference room. I strode down the quiet, carpeted hallway, boarded the private executive elevator, and descended to the ground floor. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp, freezing Chicago air. The winter wind bit sharply against my cheeks, but my lungs filled with the sweet, intoxicating breath of absolute freedom. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since Martha's passing was finally lifted. I walked to my waiting car, a man entirely reborn from the ashes of betrayal, leaving the wreckage of their lives far behind me. The legal fallout was exceptionally swift and entirely merciless. Armed with the irrefutable audio recordings detailing their explicit knowledge of the medication, tampering combined with the massive mountain of digital financial evidence Bill had meticulously extracted from their offshore accounts, the prosecuting attorneys moved with ruthless efficiency. Rachel was immediately deemed a severe flight risk. Given her extensive access to international banking channels and the horrific nature of the elder abuse allegations, the presiding federal judge vehemently denied her bail. She was remanded directly to a maximum security holding facility, her expensive designer suits permanently exchanged for a coarse, oversized institutional uniform. The confident, arrogant executive was reduced to an isolated inmate facing decades behind cold steel bars. Derek was formally charged as an active accessory to both the corporate wire fraud and the systemic elder abuse that ultimately led to Martha's tragic passing. He attempted to barter his way into a lighter sentence, frantically offering to testify against his wife, but the prosecutors did not need his compromised testimony. They already possessed the recorded confessions of his absolute complicity. His cowardice offered him no protection in the court of law. He was denied any leniency, thoroughly trapped in the inescapable legal web he had blindly helped weave. The medical supply firm acting on the anonymous dossier of evidence I had forwarded to their executive board filed immediate aggressive civil litigation to recover the $2.5 million Rachel had embezzled. They completely drained her remaining offshore accounts and seized every single physical asset the couple had acquired over the past 4 years. The crushing weight of that corporate debt, combined with the astronomical legal fees they now faced, completely and utterly destroyed them. They lost their luxury cars, their investments, and their freedom. The fraudulent power of attorney was shredded, and my home remained safely secured within the impenetrable walls of the blind trust. Returning to the quiet sanctuary of my home that evening, I poured myself a single glass of aged scotch. I walked slowly through the familiar rooms, no longer burdened by the toxic presence of the people who had tried to steal my life. I stood before the fireplace, staring at a framed photograph of Martha resting on the mantel. The house felt warm again, the dark shadows of Rachel and Derek's greed completely banished from our sacred walls. I raised my glass to her beautiful, smiling face, a silent toast to the woman who had built this life with me. I had kept my promise. I had protected our legacy with unwavering precision, ensuring that the evil they brought into our home was entirely eradicated. The storm had finally passed, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was able to close my eyes and truly rest. I looked down at the 38-year-old man sobbing uncontrollably at my feet. He was a pathetic, shattered remnant of the child I had raised, clinging to the fabric of my trousers, as if I could magically erase the horrific crimes he had actively committed. He continued to plead, his voice cracking and breaking under the crushing weight of his inevitable future. "Dad, please," he gasped, tears leaving dark, wet stains on my shoes. "I am your son. I am your blood. Do not let them take me." I did not raise my voice. I did not pull away immediately. I simply looked down at him with absolute zero emotion, feeling nothing but the clinical detachment of a judge delivering a final, inescapable verdict. "My blood died the night you stood by and let that parasite drug your mother to death," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, hollow finality. "The federal penitentiary is the cheapest nursing home I could find for you, Derek. Enjoy the amenities." I pulled my leg back with a single sharp motion, tearing the hem of my pants from his desperate grasp. The federal agents immediately hauled him up from the carpet, securing his arms as he wailed in sheer terror. Rachel was screaming vile, unhinged curses at me, her face contorted into a mask of pure demonic rage as the agents dragged her forcibly toward the heavy glass doors. I did not look back at them. I calmly adjusted my silk tie, offered Jonathan a firm nod of profound gratitude, and walked out of the conference room. I rode the elevator down in absolute silence and stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, inhaling deeply as the toxic burden of the past year finally completely evaporated from my shoulders. 6 months later, the bitter winter had finally surrendered to the vibrant, blooming warmth of spring. I stood on the pristine front walkway of my fully restored suburban home, watching the morning sunlight filter through the vibrant green leaves of the ancient oak trees. The dark, suffocating clouds of betrayal and grief that had once heavily blanketed this property had completely lifted, replaced by an undeniable aura of absolute peace and quiet triumph. The house was no longer a grim monument to Martha's tragic decline, nor was it the contested prize of 2 greedy parasitic criminals. It was my sanctuary once again. At 70 years old, a man is supposed to feel the heavy, unrelenting march of time wearing down his bones and slowing his mind. Yet standing there in the gentle morning breeze, I felt 50 again. The agonizing, drawn-out battle for my survival had not destroyed me. It had fundamentally revitalized my entire spirit. I had expertly navigated a treacherous labyrinth of deceit, financial fraud, and emotional manipulation, emerging on the other side with my dignity and my legacy entirely intact. I walked up the front steps, unlocked the heavy wooden door, and stepped inside the bright, welcoming foyer. The oppressive silence that Derek and Rachel had deliberately cultivated was gone, replaced by the soft, comforting sounds of a home that was finally breathing easily again. I took a deep breath, savoring the profound freedom of standing in a space that belonged entirely to me, free from the venomous shadows of those who sought to destroy it. Later that afternoon, I sat in Jonathan Bradley's immaculate downtown office to finalize the remaining administrative details of my estate. With the massive federal investigation effectively neutralizing Rachel and Derek, there was no longer any need for the protective barriers we had erected. I signed the necessary legal authorizations, officially unlocking the $12 million blind trust Martha had so wisely established before her passing. However, I had absolutely no intention of using that vast fortune to purchase extravagant yachts, luxury vehicles, or sprawling vacation properties. The money was not merely a financial asset. It was a powerful, tangible weapon. I leaned across the mahogany desk and handed Jonathan the finalized incorporation documents for our new venture. I had officially established the Martha Caldwell Legal Aid Foundation. Our strict, uncompromising mission was to provide free, incredibly aggressive legal representation for vulnerable seniors facing systemic financial exploitation, physical abuse, and emotional manipulation at the hands of their own deeply greedy families. We were going to actively hunt down the exact kind of parasitic predators that Rachel and Derek had chosen to be. Bill, having proven his absolute loyalty and brilliant investigative prowess, eagerly accepted a permanent position on the board of directors. He was already utilizing his extensive network of former law enforcement contacts to build a formidable team of private investigators and forensic accountants. We were constructing an impenetrable fortress of legal protection for those who could not protect themselves. Jonathan smiled warmly as he placed the corporate seal on the foundational documents, officially launching an initiative that would cement Martha's beautiful legacy for countless generations to come. The millions of dollars she had painstakingly saved would now serve as a permanent shield for the innocent and a swift, devastating sword against the wicked. I felt an incredible sense of pride knowing that Martha's incredible brilliance would continue to shine brightly, illuminating the dark corners where abusers thought they could hide and operate without any fear of absolute terrifying retribution. Before I left his office, Jonathan offered me a brief, highly clinical update regarding the ongoing criminal proceedings. The sheer volume of irrefutable evidence we had strategically delivered to the federal prosecutors left the defense attorneys with absolutely no viable avenues for negotiation. Recognizing the absolute futility of a public trial, Rachel ultimately surrendered to a comprehensive plea deal. She was formally sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. Derek, completely broken by the overwhelming reality of his horrific choices, fully confessed to his role in the devastating crimes. He was currently serving a mandatory 8-year sentence as an active accessory to massive corporate fraud and severe elder abuse. Furthermore, the $2.5 million corporate restitution debt completely annihilated their remaining finances, leaving them with absolutely nothing to return to. I listened to these developments with total detachment. I felt no lingering sadness, no parental guilt, and no residual anger. I felt only the profound, sterile peace of a skilled surgeon who had successfully excised a malignant life-threatening tumor from a healthy body. I thanked Jonathan for his exceptional service and left the towering glass building, driving my car toward the quiet rolling hills of the city cemetery. The afternoon sun was shining brightly as I walked across the manicured green grass, carrying a single perfect yellow rose. I stopped in front of the polished granite headstone bearing Martha's name. I did not fall to my knees, and I did not weep. I stood tall, the warm sun bathing my face, and gently placed the vibrant rose against the dark stone. "We got them, Martha," I said, my voice steady, ringing with an undeniable tone of absolute final triumph. "We won." I turned and walked away, my steps firm, my head held high, stepping boldly into a brand new life.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every